The kingdom of Valadrin was a place of shadows and light, where cliffs met the sea and storms whispered secrets to those who would listen. Its people spoke in hushed tones of the Alpha King, Kale, a ruler of unmatched strength and beauty, whose eyes seemed to pierce through the hearts of those who dared approach him. He wore the crown not only as a symbol of power, but as a shield against the world, a world that constantly sought to test, tempt, or betray him. Every season, noblewomen, princesses, and even sorceresses from distant lands traveled to the palace to win his favor. They danced in glittering halls, their laughter ringing like bells through the corridors. Each believed that a smile from the king would secure their place in history, and yet none ever captured his heart. Kale watched them all with calm detachment, his mind a storm no courtly charm could calm. Among the grand halls and golden chandeliers moved another figure entirely unseen. Known only as the Silent Omega, they carried no jewels, wore no silks, and spoke only when necessary. Few noticed them at all. They moved through the palace as though part of the walls themselves, tending to the gardens, helping the servants, or studying in the vast library, their presence quiet but steady. They were small, almost fragile to the eyes of many, yet beneath that quietness was a heart unafraid of the dark. It was in the library that Kale first truly saw the Omega, not with the eyes of a king assessing a subject, but with the curiosity of a man noticing something rare. The Omega was bent over a dusty tome, their fingers tracing words as though each letter held a secret. They were unaware of the world outside their pages. Kale's curiosity stirred. "What do you see in these old stories?" he asked, his voice low but firm. It carried the weight of command, yet a softness lingered that few ever heard. The Omega looked up, startled, their eyes wide, and then quickly bowed. "Only knowledge, your majesty, the kind that tells of heroes and mistakes alike." Kale inclined his head slightly, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Knowledge or truth?" The Omega paused, considering, and answered, "Perhaps both if one looks carefully enough." Something in that simple answer lingered in Kale's mind long after he left the library. He had spent his life surrounded by people who craved his power, his wealth, his title. But this quiet figure had nothing to gain, and yet seemed richer than all the others. Meanwhile, in the grand hall, the competition for Kale's attention grew fiercer. Princesses flaunted their wit and beauty, sorceresses whispered secrets meant to enthrall him. Their efforts were bold, daring, and sometimes dangerous. Yet Kale remained untouched by their charms. They did not stir him. None could. The Silent Omega, unnoticed by all, continued their quiet life tending the palace gardens. The scent of night-blooming flowers filled the air as they moved, and Kale often found himself wandering the corridors late at night, drawn by something he could not name. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was something deeper, a sense that the Omega, who asked for nothing, was somehow vital to the storm within him. One evening, during a grand gala thrown in honor of visiting dignitaries, the Omega found themselves at the center of an unexpected moment. A courtier, jealous of their quiet presence, attempted to humiliate them publicly. The room fell silent as the courtier spoke, aiming a cruel jest that would wound the unprepared. But Kale's eyes met the Omega's across the hall. There was no laughter, no mockery, only the storm within him stirring to life. Before the courtier could finish, Kale rose, his movement commanding silence. "Enough," he said, his voice like rolling thunder. The courtiers froze. The king's eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over the hall. "This palace does not welcome cruelty disguised as humor." The Omega's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the unspoken recognition in Kale's gaze. No one else had ever intervened. The king could have ignored the incident, as he always did. Instead, he had chosen them. Later that night, as the palace slept under the silver light of the moon, Kale found the Omega in the gardens. Rain from the afternoon storm still clung to the leaves, and the scent of wet earth mingled with night-blooming jasmine. "You do not seek attention," Kale said, stepping from the shadows. "Yet the world would dismiss someone like you too easily. Why?" The Omega met his gaze steadily. "I do not need to be noticed, your majesty. I only seek to do what is right in small ways for those who cannot speak for themselves." Kale studied them, feeling the pull of something unfamiliar, respect, admiration, perhaps even longing. He had known many who desired him, but none who cared so little for what he could give them. It was intoxicating in its purity. As the moonlight danced on their features, Kale realized that the Omega's silence was not weakness. It was strength hidden beneath humility. And for the first time, he felt the stirrings of a bond he had never experienced. But the palace, ever watchful and cruel in its intrigues, did not forget the Omega's quiet defiance. The jealous courtiers, humiliated by Kale's intervention at the gala, began to whisper of plots, planning ways to strike at the Omega when the king's eyes were elsewhere. The Omega, unaware of the brewing danger, continued their daily routine. They tended the roses by the terrace, cared for the injured falcons in the royal aviary, and studied the old maps in the library. Life seemed ordinary, though beneath it, threads of destiny were weaving a story that neither they nor the king could yet see. Kale, on the other hand, found himself drawn to the Omega in ways that unsettled him. He had spent years commanding armies, negotiating with kings and queens, and navigating the treacherous tides of politics. Yet this quiet figure, unseen by all but him, stirred emotions that no conquest, no victory, and no crown could satisfy. Even the Alpha King, fierce and untouchable, could not ignore the quiet strength before him. And as the wind howled outside the palace walls, carrying the scent of the sea and the promise of a coming storm, Kale knew that this Omega, this silent, overlooked soul, was the first person in years to make his heart feel unsteady. The night deepened, and the palace grew quiet. Kale returned to his chambers, but his thoughts lingered on the Omega. Who were they truly? What hidden strengths lay behind their calm exterior? And why, for the first time in his life, did he feel as though he were not the one in control? Little did either of them know that the storm outside was only a reflection of the storm to come. A storm that would sweep through the palace, testing loyalty, courage, and the hearts of both the Alpha King and the silent Omega. The jealous courtiers would strike, secrets would unravel, and the Omega would find themselves at the center of a moment that could change everything. And yet, even as the first lightning split the sky over the cliffs of Valadrin, a quiet promise lingered in the air, that perhaps, in a world of ambition and deceit, the one who did not seek the crown might be the one to claim the king's heart. Kale, lying awake, stared at the ceiling, thinking of the Omega. His chest tightened in a way he had never known, and a single thought repeated itself in his mind. No one else could ever matter like this. No one else could ever matter at all. Meanwhile, the Omega, unaware of the king's silent gaze and the dangerous eyes watching them, closed their book and stepped into the terrace. Rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the smell of wet stone and earth. They breathed deeply, feeling the night around them, calm yet anticipating something unseen. The night held its secrets, and so did the palace. Both King and Omega were caught in a quiet orbit, one that neither fully understood, yet which had begun to pull them inexorably together. And as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft shades of rose and gold, a shadow watched from the high balcony, a jealous courtier, plotting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The palace would not remain quiet for long. The story had begun. The palace of Valadrin, once calm under the soft moonlight, now seemed alive with whispers and secrets. The halls carried echoes of plotting voices, and the courtiers moved with caution, knowing that their every action could spark Kale's wrath. But among all the scheming nobles, one figure remained largely unseen, the silent Omega. The Omega had returned to their quiet routines, tending the gardens, arranging the library, and caring for the small creatures of the palace. Yet even as they moved among the familiar walls, a subtle tension hung in the air. The Alpha King's gaze lingered more often, watching not from a distance, but with quiet intensity. Kale had begun walking the halls at night, finding excuses to encounter the Omega. One evening, as the sky turned the color of blood orange and clouds scuttled across the horizon, Kale appeared in the gardens where the Omega tended the roses. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and jasmine, and the last rays of sun shimmered on the petals. "You are here again," the Omega said softly, not startled this time, merely observing him with calm eyes. Kale approached, hands clasped behind his back. "You do not tire?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, blending with the rustle of leaves. "I do not work for praise," the Omega replied simply. "I work because it is needed." Kale's lips curved in the faintest smile. "It seems the world does not notice such effort." The Omega tilted their head. "Perhaps that is its blessing." There was a quiet understanding between them in that moment, something neither had expected to feel. A connection not born of words or flattery, but of mutual respect. Kale felt a strange pull, an unspoken need to protect and understand this person who refused to bow to ambition or fear. But the palace was far from peaceful. The jealous courtiers, humiliated at the gala, whispered behind closed doors. They had watched Kale's attention shift, and their envy grew sharp as knives. "We cannot allow such a nobody to hold the king's favor," one whispered in the dark hallways, another nodded. "She or he must be taught their place." Unknown to the Omega, these whispers carried a dangerous weight. Plans were being made, small traps, tricks, and even rumors designed to tarnish the Omega's reputation. But one thing the courtiers did not anticipate was that the king, though silent in many matters, observed all. And he did not forget. The next day, Kale summoned the Omega to the War Council room. It was unusual, for the Omega was not trained in politics, strategy, or diplomacy. Yet there was a parchment on the table, maps of the kingdom, and the king's gaze fixed upon them with intensity. "There is a threat," Kale said, gesturing to the map. "Not from foreign armies, but from within. Someone seeks to destabilize the palace." The Omega studied the parchment with quiet concentration. "The courtiers?" they asked, voice calm but precise. Kale's eyes darkened. "Perhaps they think subtlety will shield them, but they underestimate the consequences." Together they began to study the maps, tracing hidden passages, secret chambers, and weak points that the palace might hide. The Omega's mind worked like a quiet river, flowing through information, finding patterns others missed. Kale watched them, realizing that their wisdom was not just in books or courage, it was in seeing what others could not. As night fell, the palace became a theater of shadows. Courtiers moved like whispers in the corridors, setting minor traps. Poison wine meant for servants, false rumors meant for gossip, and enchanted mirrors to mislead anyone passing by. But the Omega navigated these threats with surprising skill, avoiding danger without drawing attention. Kale observed silently, growing more intrigued yet more conflicted. He had been raised to rely on strength, to conquer through power and fear. Yet the Omega's quiet presence was shaping him in ways he did not yet understand. He found himself seeking their counsel, noticing their small gestures, and feeling a longing he could not name. One night, under a silver moon, Kale took the Omega to the cliffs overlooking the sea. Waves crashed against the rocks below and lightning flashed in the distance. "Do you ever wonder why the storms come?" Kale asked, his voice almost lost in the roar of the wind. The Omega looked out over the churning waters. "Storms are nature's way of reminding us of what we cannot control," they said softly. "But they also clear the air, make way for new growth." Kale's gaze lingered on them. "And yet we cannot hide from them. We must face the storm." "Yes," the Omega said quietly. "But facing the storm does not mean we face it alone." Kale's heart tightened. Their words struck him deeper than any sword ever could. He realized that the Omega had more courage than anyone in the palace, more than the bravest knights or cleverest courtiers. And yet they carried it with quiet humility, not for praise, not for power. The next day, a minor attack occurred in the palace. A set of enchanted mirrors in the hallways created illusions to confuse and trap passers-by. Servants panicked, but the Omega, moving like a shadow, guided them safely out, revealing hidden paths that none but Kale had known. For the first time, other courtiers noticed, not with admiration but with fear and resentment. Kale, watching the Omega from the shadows, felt an emotion he could not name. Pride, perhaps, but deeper. An urgent desire to protect them, to see them recognized for who they truly were. And yet, he could not allow his feelings to be known. The court would never forgive such a choice, and Kale had spent his life fearing weakness. Days passed, and the palace grew tense. Rumors of curses whispered among the servants, tales of a dark force tied to the royal line, a prophecy that foretold destruction should the king trust the wrong heart. The Omega, though unafraid of physical danger, seemed thoughtful when these whispers reached their ears. "You believe in curses?" Kale asked one evening when the two walked among the hedges, their hands brushing occasionally but never touching. "I believe in consequences," the Omega said, "and in choices. Curses are only words if one does not act wisely." Kale studied them, realizing that in their calm, rational way they held the key to balance, the very thing he lacked. The king of Valadrin, feared and revered, had spent his life relying on force. The Omega relied on understanding. The first storm of the season came that night. Rain pelted the palace, lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the walls. Kale and the Omega stood together on the terrace, wet but unafraid, watching the storm rage. "You are not afraid," Kale said, shivering slightly from the cold. "I do not fear what can be faced," the Omega replied. "The storm tests us, but it cannot break us if we stand steady." Kale's heart beat faster. He wanted to speak, to tell them how he felt, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he merely stood beside them, feeling a strange peace, even as the storm raged around them. The next morning, the court's jealousy became more evident. A messenger brought news of a minor sabotage. Supplies had been hidden and servants blamed for mistakes they did not make. Kale's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. He knew the Omega could navigate the danger, and indeed, the Omega did. They moved quickly, discovering hidden paths, unmasking false accusations, and guiding Kale's forces to secure the palace without anyone realizing the danger had been true. Kale watched silently, pride swelling within him. Yet he also felt fear, not for the palace but for the Omega. He realized that their courage, their quiet wisdom, and their unwavering calm had drawn him into something he could not control. As night fell again, Kale approached the Omega in the library. The moonlight cast silver patterns across the floor and shadows stretched long among the shelves. "You are remarkable," Kale said, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "I have never known anyone like you." The Omega looked at him, calm but curious. "And what is it you see in me, your majesty?" Kale hesitated. He could not say the words that trembled at the edges of his heart. Instead, he nodded. "A truth that I did not expect to find." The Omega smiled faintly, a small curve of lips that seemed to hold centuries of understanding. "Perhaps truths are easier to see when one is not seeking them." Kale could not speak. He simply stood there, feeling the weight of something that neither titles nor crowns could define. Something stronger than power, stronger than fear, the quiet pull of connection. Yet the palace, as always, was alive with hidden danger. In the shadows, the jealous courtiers watched, their eyes sharp, their intentions dark. They did not yet know the strength of the bond forming between Kale and the Omega, nor the courage that burned quietly within the silent figure. The storm outside the palace had passed, but within its walls another storm was only beginning, a storm of hearts, of secrets, and of choices that would test both the king and the Omega, and neither could turn away. As Kale left the library that night, he glanced back once more. The Omega's eyes met his, steady and unwavering, and in that moment a silent understanding passed between them, an understanding that neither feared the coming shadows, for they would face them together. But far above, in the high towers of the palace, a shadow moved. One of the jealous courtiers had begun to put plans into motion that would challenge not only the Omega's courage, but the Alpha King's heart. The true storm of Valadrin was about to begin. And the dance of shadows had begun. The palace of Valadrin, usually calm under the silver light of the moon, had grown restless. Whispers floated along the corridors, and shadows seemed to twist in corners where no light reached. The jealous courtiers, frustrated by their failures, were no longer content with mere schemes or rumors. They had begun to act, testing the courage of the silent Omega and daring the Alpha King, Kale, to intervene. The Omega sensed the tension long before any sign appeared. Something in the air shifted, a chill that touched the bones, the faint hum of magic, the unease of servants who moved like frightened birds. Yet the Omega remained calm. Years of quiet observation had taught them to see threats before others noticed, to anticipate danger before it arrived. Kale, meanwhile, was not blind to the shifting currents of the palace. He had watched his rivals move and plan, but now he felt an urgency he had never known. It was not only the safety of the palace at stake, it was the Omega. And with every day, every small act of courage, they had become far more than a quiet presence in his life. They had become essential. That evening, Kale summoned the Omega to the strategy hall, a place rarely visited by anyone outside the court's inner circle. Maps of the kingdom were spread across the table, marked with the locations of patrols, secret tunnels, and magical wards. Kale's voice was calm but firm. "There is a threat in the eastern wing," he said, pointing to a hidden passage. "Someone is using the old corridors to move unseen. They intend to strike tonight." The Omega leaned over the map, their fingers tracing the paths with precision. "The corridors are narrow. Only someone familiar with the palace could navigate them so quickly. It must be one of the courtiers," they said. Kale nodded. "You are right, and yet their magic is subtle, disguised. It could trap the unwary or worse." I can guide you, the Omega said, and ensure no one is harmed. Kale studied them silently for a moment. Their courage, their calm intelligence, and their unwavering loyalty struck him more deeply than any sword or spell could. Very well, he said finally. We move at midnight together. As the hour approached, the palace grew quiet as if holding its breath. The storm from the previous night had passed, but a new tension lingered in the air, thick and electric. Kale and the Omega moved through the halls silently, avoiding patrols and hidden alarms. Their footsteps echoed faintly, yet neither faltered. The eastern wing was dark, lit only by flickering torches that cast long shadows against the stone walls. Kale's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his sword, but he trusted the Omega to lead the way. The silent Omega moved ahead, confident and precise, their eyes scanning every corner, every shadow for signs of danger. Suddenly, a faint shimmer appeared at the far end of the corridor, a magical trap meant to ensnare the unwary. Without hesitation, the Omega extended a hand, murmured a word of power, and the trap dissolved into smoke. Kale's eyes widened slightly. Few could undo magic so quickly, yet the Omega moved as though it were simple work. You have strength beyond what anyone sees, Kale whispered, more to himself than to them. The Omega glanced at him, calm and composed. Strength is not always visible, they said softly. It is in courage, in wisdom, in knowing when to act. Kale felt a stir in his chest, a pull he could no longer ignore. He wanted to speak, to tell them how much they mattered, but the words lodged somewhere deep inside him, caught between fear and longing. They continued through the corridors, discovering more traps, poisoned spikes, hidden alarms, enchanted mirrors meant to confuse intruders. Each time the Omega guided them safely past, their knowledge and courage proving invaluable. Kale's respect for them deepened with every step, and with it an emotion that he had long kept hidden. At last they reached the chamber where the courtiers had gathered, intent on confrontation. The room was filled with soft shadows, flickering with candlelight. When the courtiers realized they had been discovered, they attempted to flee, but the Omega moved swiftly, using knowledge of secret passages to block their escape. Kale entered behind them, silent but commanding. The courtiers froze, realizing they were trapped not by brute force but by the skill and intelligence of the silent Omega. Kale's eyes swept over the room, and his voice was calm but icy. You sought to harm those who serve this palace, he said. You thought cunning could protect you, but you underestimated one thing, the courage of those you dismissed. The courtiers bowed, defeated, their pride shattered. The Omega stepped forward, their eyes steady, their voice calm. Let this be a lesson, they said. Strength is not only in power or titles, but in wisdom and courage. Those who act with malice will always falter. Kale felt a surge of pride and admiration for the Omega. He had known they were brave, but seeing them command authority and face danger with such calm assurance was like witnessing the rising sun over the cliffs of Valadrin. The palace had underestimated them, but Kale had not. As the courtiers were escorted away, Kale turned to the Omega. You are more remarkable than I imagined, he said, his voice low, almost vulnerable. I do not know how to thank you. The Omega shook their head gently. There is no need for thanks. I do what must be done. That is all, Kale's chest tightened. It is not enough to say that. You have risked yourself, guided me, protected this palace, and yet you ask for nothing in return. The Omega's eyes met his, calm and unwavering. Sometimes the greatest reward is knowing that the right choice was made. Kale felt a strange warmth spread through him, a mix of admiration, longing, and something he had never experienced before, an unspoken connection that went beyond words. He wanted to reach out, to touch their hand, to tell them they were more than just a silent figure in the halls. But he held back, knowing that some bonds needed time to grow and some hearts required patience. The night deepened, and Kale and the Omega stood together on the palace terrace. The cliffs rose sharply beside them, and the sea crashed against the rocks below, wild and untamed. Lightning flickered on the horizon, echoing the storm that had passed days before, but this time it seemed to reflect the storm inside Kale himself. You have changed this palace, Kale said quietly. Not by magic nor by force, but by presence. You have reminded me that courage does not always roar, and strength does not always strike. The Omega smiled faintly. And you have reminded me that even the strongest hearts can feel fear, and even the proudest rulers can learn humility. Kale's gaze lingered on them. He wanted to speak, to confess how he felt, yet the words were trapped inside him. Instead, he simply stood beside them, letting the wind and the sound of the waves speak what he could not. Meanwhile, the shadows in the palace did not rest. The jealous courtiers, though defeated, had not given up. Their resentment festered like a hidden poison, and they began plotting again, more cautiously this time. They whispered of curses, of forbidden magic, of secrets long buried. They could not foresee, however, that the Omega's courage and intelligence had grown far beyond the fears of others. In the following days, the bond between Kale and the Omega deepened, though still unspoken. They shared quiet moments in the library, studied maps together in the strategy room, and walked the gardens under the moonlight. Every glance, every word carried weight and meaning. Neither needed to speak of their feelings. They were understood without words. Yet danger still lingered. Rumors of the curse tied to the royal line grew louder. Servants spoke in hushed tones of a prophecy, that the king's heart, if led astray, could bring ruin to the kingdom. Kale had never believed in such tales, but as he watched the Omega move through the palace with calm courage, he realized that perhaps the prophecy did not speak of malice, but of carelessness, of failing to see the truth in someone who did not seek the crown. The first true test of the Omega's courage arrived one evening. A servant rushed into the strategy hall, breathless and frightened. "My lord, my lady, the eastern gardens, the trees are burning, and a figure moves within the flames." Kale and the Omega ran without hesitation. The gardens were filled with smoke and shadows, a magical fire threatening to spread. Most would have panicked, but the Omega remained calm. They moved through the smoke, their hands tracing symbols in the air, whispering words that extinguished the flames as if by miracle. Kale watched, awe and admiration swelling within him. No one else could have done this, not the bravest knights, not the cleverest sorcerers. Only the Omega, calm and fearless, could face such danger and protect the palace without hesitation. When the fire was finally quelled, the Omega turned to Kale, their eyes calm but their voice steady. The danger was real, but not beyond reason. It is always possible to face what frightens us if we act wisely and without fear. Kale's chest tightened. He wanted to tell them how extraordinary they were, how much he admired and needed them. But he still held back, knowing that such words could carry weight beyond understanding. Instead, he simply reached out, lightly touching their arm in a gesture of trust and connection. The Omega did not flinch. Instead, they met his gaze, and in that moment both understood something unspoken, that their bond was growing stronger, deeper, and unbreakable, even in the face of jealousy, magic, and danger. And yet, as they returned to the palace, shadows moved in the corners. The jealous courtiers had begun plotting once more. Their schemes were subtler this time, intertwined with magic and deception, designed to test the Omega's courage and the king's heart in ways neither could yet foresee. The palace of Valadrin, silent under the stars, held its breath. The true storm was coming, a storm of hearts, power, and destiny. And the silent Omega, once overlooked, now stood at the center of it all, ready to rise. The storm that had long whispered at the edges of Valadrin finally arrived in full force. Dark clouds gathered above the palace, and the sea crashed violently against the cliffs. The kingdom's usual calm was shattered, and within the walls of the fortress, tension ran higher than ever. The jealous courtiers, defeated in the past, had now united in secret, determined to destabilize the Alpha King and seize control. Their plans were clever, their magic subtle, and their intentions dark. Yet Kale, the Alpha King, was no longer alone in facing danger. Beside him stood the silent Omega, the quiet figure whose courage, intelligence, and calm strength had become the center of the king's world. No longer unnoticed, the Omega had risen fully to their place in the palace, guiding Kale through challenges both political and magical. That morning, Kale summoned the Omega to the strategy hall. Maps of the kingdom were spread across the table, alongside letters of warning and reports from loyal guards. Kale's eyes, sharp and determined, met the Omega's calm gaze. "The courtiers have plotted again," he said. "They have hidden enchanted traps in the western halls and seek to strike at the heart of the palace tonight." The Omega studied the maps carefully, their mind moving quickly through possibilities, calculating risks and solutions. "We can protect the palace," they said softly but firmly. "We must act together and remain calm. Panic is the courtier's greatest weapon." Kale nodded. "You have been right every step of the way. I trust you completely." The Omega's eyes met his, calm but steady. "Then we will succeed, together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the palace prepared for the coming trial. Guards doubled their patrols, wards glowed faintly along the walls, and torches flickered in anticipation. The Alpha King and the Silent Omega moved through the corridors, checking the eastern and western wings, dismantling hidden traps and guiding servants to safety. Their movements were synchronized, a silent partnership built on trust and respect. But the greatest threat awaited in the central hall, where the courtiers had gathered with a mix of cunning and desperation. Magical wards flickered and pulsed, spells hidden within tapestries and chandeliers, ready to unleash chaos. Kale and the Omega entered silently, their presence alone commanding attention. The courtiers froze, realizing too late that the King and the Omega were prepared. Kale's eyes swept over the room, calculating, assessing, and finally focusing on the leader of the plot, a woman of noble blood whose ambition had blinded her to wisdom. "You have underestimated us," Kale said, his voice calm but firm. "And in doing so, you have placed yourselves in danger." The courtiers tried to act, chanting spells and invoking illusions, but the Omega moved like a shadow among them. With gestures precise and words quiet, they dissolved traps, countered magic, and guided the king's forces to secure the room. Kale fought not with anger, but with skill, intercepting attacks and protecting those who could not defend themselves. In the chaos, the leader of the courtiers attempted to flee, but the Omega anticipated her movement, blocking the path with steady courage. "There is nowhere to hide," they said. "No darkness can protect those who act with malice." Kale stepped forward, his presence imposing yet calm. "You will answer for your actions," he said. The woman bowed her head, defeated, and the room fell silent, the threat finally ended. With the danger over, Kale and the Omega stood together in the central hall, surrounded by the loyal servants and guards who had witnessed their courage. For the first time, the king spoke words he had kept hidden for so long. "You have proven yourself beyond measure," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "Not only in skill and courage, but in heart. You have saved this palace and perhaps even saved me." The Omega remained calm, their eyes steady. "I have only done what is necessary, that is all." Kale shook his head, stepping closer. "It is never only that. You have risked everything without thought of reward, guided me, and stood firm when others faltered. That is more than courage. It is wisdom, strength, and love." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The Omega looked at him, surprise flickering briefly before calm returned. "Love?" they asked quietly. Kale nodded. "Yes, you have awakened something in me that I thought was impossible. I have seen the strength, the bravery, and the wisdom in you that no one else has ever had. And I cannot ignore it." The Omega's chest rose and fell slowly, their mind turning over his words. No one had ever spoken to them like this, not with such honesty, not with such depth. Slowly they reached out, touching his hand lightly. "Then perhaps the prophecy was not about doom," they said softly. "Perhaps it was about finding the right heart to trust." Kale's chest tightened. The storm outside the palace seemed to mirror the storm within him, wild, unstoppable, and yet filled with light. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to stand vulnerable, to show a side that no crown, no title, and no power had ever allowed him to reveal. The palace, sensing the shift, seemed to breathe with them. Shadows softened, and the walls no longer felt oppressive. For the first time in years, the Alpha King felt at peace, standing beside someone whose strength was not in dominance, but in courage, wisdom, and quiet power. The courtiers, those who remained loyal, watched in awe. None had expected that a figure so silent, so unassuming, could rise to such greatness. None had foreseen that the king's heart would be captured not by beauty, ambition, or power, but by the quiet presence of someone who sought nothing and gave everything. As night deepened, Kale and the Omega walked to the cliffs overlooking the sea, the waves crashing below like drums of eternity. Lightning illuminated the horizon, but there was no fear in their eyes, only understanding, trust, and connection. "You have changed me," Kale said softly. "I believed I could rule alone, that strength was all I needed, but I see now that strength without trust, without understanding, is incomplete." The Omega smiled faintly. "And I have learned that even the quietest heart can hold courage beyond imagining. Even those who seem small can change the world." Kale reached out, taking the Omega's hand fully in his own. "Then let us face the future together. No storm, no threat, no shadow can stand against us if we stand side by side." The Omega's gaze softened, and for the first time they allowed themselves to speak openly of what they felt. I trust you, Kale, and I will stand with you no matter what comes. Thunder rolled across the cliffs, and the storm outside finally began to break, rain softening to mist. In that quiet moment, the palace itself seemed to sigh with relief. The Alpha King and the Silent Omega, once worlds apart, now stood united, a bond forged through courage, trials, and understanding. The jealous courtiers had been defeated, their plots exposed, and their power broken. But the palace still held whispers of magic, secrets, and shadows, reminders that challenges would always return. Yet Kale and the Omega knew that together they could face anything. In the following days, the king acknowledged the Omega publicly, not as a servant, nor as a quiet observer, but as a partner, a guide, and the heart that had saved both him and the palace. The court watched in awe, realizing that true power was not in ambition or flattery, but in courage, wisdom, and the bonds formed through trust. Kale and the Omega spent long hours walking the gardens, studying maps, and speaking of dreams and futures. Their bond grew stronger with every shared glance, every quiet smile, every act of courage in the face of danger. The Alpha King had found his equal, not in battle or ambition, but in heart and soul. One evening, under the soft glow of the moon, Kale turned to the Omega. You have made this palace stronger, but more than that, you have made me stronger. I cannot imagine facing the world without you. The Omega's hand brushed against his, their eyes calm but full of emotion. And I cannot imagine standing anywhere else but by your side. Together, we are stronger than any storm. The wind carried their words across the cliffs, the sea below echoing their promise. The palace, once filled with whispers and jealousy, now held quiet peace and the certainty of change. The Alpha King and the Silent Omega, against all odds, had found one another, their bond unbreakable, their hearts aligned. And as the first rays of dawn broke over Valadrin, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, a new era began. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. True courage was quiet, true strength was shared, and true love was forged in the fires of trust, respect, and unwavering devotion. Kale and the Omega stood together on the terrace, hands entwined, gazing out at the kingdom they would protect together. The palace was no longer a place of shadows and fear. It was a home of courage, love, and hope. And though challenges would come again, they knew they would face them together, stronger than any storm. The Silent Omega, once overlooked, had risen, and the Alpha King, once alone, had finally found a heart worth trusting. Together, they would rule not just with power, but with wisdom, courage, and love. And so, under the golden light of morning, Valadrin saw the beginning of a legend. That the heart unseen by the world could capture the heart of the greatest king, and that love, courage, and trust could conquer even the darkest shadows. The silent throne had been claimed, not by ambition, but by the quiet strength of a heart that dared to be brave, wise, and true.